My sister lied to our parents that I was expelled to have me disowned. 10 years later, I was the presiding judge on her $450,000 fraud case. The booking photo in the file was printed in stark black and white, but I didn't need color to recognize her. Her chin was tilted at the exact same practiced, innocent angle she had used for our family Christmas cards for as long as I could remember. And I sat in my chambers at 7:40 in the morning, holding a thick manila case file with my own sister's face stapled to the inside cover. My hands weren't shaking yet. That physical reaction would come later, a delayed shockwave of a decade of buried grief. Right then, I just sat very still. The overhead fluorescent light was humming a low, mechanical tune. A cold cup of black coffee was sweating a dark ring onto the printed case summary on my mahogany desk. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear a courthouse custodian running a heavy vacuum over the carpet, creating that particular, hollow pre-opening quiet a massive municipal building has before anyone official arrives for the day. I read the charging document twice, then a third time, scanning the text to make absolutely sure I wasn't inventing a bizarre coincidence out of a common name. I wasn't. The defendant was Maya Sterling, formerly Maya Vance. My sister. Wire fraud. 9 counts. Embezzlement from a registered nonprofit organization. 1 count. Nearly $450,000 moved in agonizingly small, calculated increments over 3 years, dressed up as legitimate vendor payments to a shell company that didn't exist. 10 years of absolute, suffocating silence hadn't prepared me for the particular kind of quiet that settles over a courtroom when the person who told your entire family you were a total disgrace realizes you are the one holding the gavel. But that quiet was still 2 hours away. First, you need to understand the architecture of our family, and how a malicious lie a 21-year-old girl told over a casual Sunday phone call mutated into a decade of total estrangement. Nobody in my family ever thought to question Maya. I had been the quiet one for as long as I could remember. I was the one who left for college 3 states away, moving from Ohio to Massachusetts, and stopped showing up for every minor family event. Maya, on the other hand, stayed close. She called every Sunday at exactly 6 p.m. She showed up with 3 bags of expensive groceries the week our mother had her gallbladder removed. She cried on cue at exactly the right moments, producing the kind of soft, tragic crying that made an entire room want to drop everything and protect her. And for a long time, I never once resented her for it. Not really. Because it was just who she had always been, and we had all accepted our roles. Our father had managed a local hardware store for 30 years before he finally retired. He was the kind of stoic, Midwestern man who measured love and reliability in physical presence and completed chores rather than spoken words. Our mother owned a small, struggling bakery 3 blocks from the house we grew up in. The heavy, sweet smell of vanilla extract and the sharp scent of roasted coffee beans were permanently baked into every single family gathering I could remember. Sunday dinners at their scuffed oak table ran the exact same way for 20 years. A heavy pot roast in the center. The local evening news muted on the small television in the background. Maya doing absolutely all of the talking, weaving elaborate stories about her week, while I quietly passed the side dishes and only answered when directly spoken to. And nobody in that warm, food-scented kitchen ever seemed to notice that one child in the room had somehow become part of the furniture. Maya had a terrifying gift that neither of my parents ever quite named out loud. She could walk into a room, instantly read the emotional temperature, figure out exactly what everyone in it desperately needed to hear, and say it a half second before anyone else even thought to. I used to deeply admire that about her. It took me years of therapy and distance to understand that this same exact gift worked just as well on people who deserved better from her as it did on people who deserved worse. I was in my 2nd year of law school when the fracture happened. I lived in a freezing, tiny studio apartment in Boston with a cheap coffee maker that violently leaked boiling water onto the linoleum counter every 3rd morning. I had stacks of instant ramen in the cabinet, and a massive corkboard over my cramped desk with complex case briefs pinned to it in 3 different colors of ink. I was exhausted, stressed, and entirely focused on surviving my torts and contracts classes. Then, the phone call came. It was from my father instead of my mother, which should have immediately told me something was terribly wrong before he even said a single word. He never called me directly. He didn't say hello. He just said that my mother had heard from Maya that I had been expelled. Maya had told them, with supposed tears in her eyes, that I had been caught blatantly cheating on a final contracts exam, that the law school was building a massive disciplinary file against me, and that I was too deeply embarrassed and ashamed to tell them the truth myself. He said it flatly, his voice devoid of warmth, like a man reading a grim weather report he didn't like but entirely believed. "Your mother's not doing well with this, Julian," he said. And I remember standing there, the leaky coffee maker hissing behind me, thinking it was incredibly strange that he led with my mother's feelings before he had asked me a single, solitary question about whether any of this insane accusation was actually true. I told him it wasn't true. I told him I was standing in my apartment, looking at my textbooks. I told him I could immediately email him my official, sealed transcript that exact same night. I offered to send my actual class ranking, which was in the top 10%. I offered to have a direct message sent from the university registrar if he wanted third-party proof. He just sighed, a heavy, disappointed sound, and said in that same flat voice that Maya wouldn't ever make something like that up. He said she had been the one showing up for this family for years, taking care of them, while I had abandoned them for the East Coast. He told me that maybe I should seriously think about why it was so incredibly easy for them to believe the absolute worst about someone who was already halfway gone from their lives. I should have caught the pattern sooner, honestly. When we were kids, Maya managed the metal coffee can where our 5th grade class kept the fundraiser money for a highly anticipated spring trip to the state capital. She counted it out loud every single Friday afternoon in front of our teacher, Mrs. Gable, while the rest of us packed up our messy desks. When the can came up $14 short one random week, Maya didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. She just pressed both of her small hands over her mouth, widened her eyes, and said in a small, wet, trembling voice that she must have miscounted. She sobbed that she had been so incredibly careful, that she couldn't believe this nightmare was happening to her of all people, and that she felt like a failure. Mrs. Gable immediately crossed the classroom and put a comforting arm around Maya's shoulders before anyone else had even mentally processed what was missing. A quiet boy named Leo, who had done absolutely nothing but politely volunteer to count the can twice that same afternoon to help out, got quietly and permanently reassigned to a different, menial fundraising job for the rest of the year. I remember Leo telling me at recess, completely baffled and close to tears, that he still didn't understand what he had done wrong. I remembered that specific story for a very long time as a story about Maya being highly sensitive. It took me a decade of hindsight to understand it as a story about Maya being incredibly fast. My mother completely stopped answering my calls within that exact same week. My father sent one single text message a few days later. It read, "Don't contact your mother again until you're ready to be honest with us and apologize to your sister." I read that text standing in my freezing kitchen with a pot of water coming to a rolling boil behind me. I remember thinking, with a strange, detached, icy clarity, that I had two choices. I could spend my life fighting this, or I could just work. Fighting it required people who were actually willing to be convinced, and I didn't have any of those. So I worked. I stubbornly emailed my official, watermarked transcript to my mother's email address anyway, just once. I instantly got back an automated reply saying the account no longer existed. She had completely changed her email. I understood only years later that this was likely done on Maya's direct advice, to make it easier for my mother to hold the boundaries against her toxic, lying son. I tried calling my father's cell phone twice more over the following month. Both calls went straight to his voicemail. I didn't leave a message either time because I couldn't think of a single version of "it isn't true" that hadn't already completely failed me once. My hands were violently shaking the second time I hung up the phone. It was at the phone, an actual, uncontrollable physical shake that I had to wait out, sitting on the edge of my cheap mattress for 20 minutes before I could even pick up my study materials again. My law school's registrar, a soft-spoken, incredibly kind woman named Evelyn, who had helped me sort out a massive financial aid mix-up the year before, noticed my distress. She offered once to call my parents directly from her office line and confirm my excellent academic standing herself. I remember standing in her doorway, clutching my backpack, and turning her generous offer down. Some stubborn, deeply wounded, bleeding part of me had decided that if the truth needed a third party to be believed by my own parents, it wasn't really being believed at all. I think about that specific decision more than almost any other one I made that entire year. I still don't know if it was foolish pride, necessary self-protection, or whether by then there was much of a difference left between the two. That first Thanksgiving alone was agonizing. I ate a dry turkey club sandwich standing at the sticky counter of a glowing neon diner 3 blocks from my apartment. I couldn't stomach the thought of sitting in a booth by myself, watching happy, intact families laughing through the frosted window glass. I told myself that whole first year that the situation would eventually blow over. I convinced myself that the moment somebody actually called the school and asked for the records, the illusion would shatter. Nobody ever called the school. It is a profoundly strange, isolating thing to learn at 22 years old that the truth does not automatically defend itself. Somebody actually has to want to check. And my family didn't want to. 5 years into the suffocating silence, I made one final, desperate attempt at connection, and it's the one I still think about the most. A cousin on my mother's side got married in a large, gaudy banquet hall 2 towns over from where my parents lived. There were warm string lights, a rented polished oak dance floor, and a live band playing cheesy songs I half recognized from childhood weddings. I found out about the wedding entirely secondhand, through a mutual college friend who had married into that side of the family and assumed, quite reasonably, that I had already been invited. I wasn't. I went anyway. I drove for 2 hours, telling myself the whole way that I would just stand in the back near the coat check. I told myself that seeing them from a distance would be enough, that I absolutely wasn't there to make a dramatic scene, just to briefly exist in the exact same room as my own parents for 10 minutes after 5 years of not existing to them at all. I saw my father first. He was wearing a dark navy suit I instantly recognized from every major holiday of my childhood, laughing warmly at a joke someone made near the open bar. My mother was sitting at a decorated table near the front. For one long, agonizing second, her eyes swept casually across the crowded room and landed directly on me. I watched her brain register exactly who I was. I saw the flash of recognition. And then, I watched her look away deliberately. She didn't look angry, or sad, or shocked. She looked away the exact way you look away from a piece of furniture you've already decided you don't want to buy. The way you look away from something that simply isn't there. My chest went incredibly tight in a way I hadn't felt since that first year of law school. I stood by the heavy exit doors for maybe 4 agonizing minutes, my hands freezing cold, waiting for either of them to cross the room. Waiting for a nod, a gesture, anything. When neither of them did, I turned around, pushed through the doors, and left before the best man's toast even started. I drove 2 hours back to Boston in the pitch black without turning on the radio once. The silence in the car was deafening. I never tried again after that night. Some doors, I brutally learned, you can knock on exactly as hard as the person on the other side is willing to hear. I finished at the absolute top of my cohort. I walked across a massive stage in a rented black gown, with absolutely no one in the sprawling audience I was related to. It was a glaring fact I noticed much more sharply than I let myself show at the crowded reception afterward. I spent the afternoon making polite, hollow small talk with other students' parents about a family I didn't bother correcting anyone on. I immediately secured a prestigious clerkship for 2 years under Judge Marcus Thorne. He was a terrifying, brilliant man who had spent 34 years on the federal bench by the time I sat across from him at my initial interview. He was a man who aggressively read legal briefs with a red pen clenched tightly in his teeth, and he once told me that the law was the only family in the world that never asked you to lie for it. During my first month clerking, he asked me why nobody ever called the chambers on my birthday. He'd sharply noticed I never took the day off the way the other young clerks did to celebrate. I told him, very carefully and precisely, that my family and I weren't close. It was true in the driest, most technical sense a sentence can possibly be true. He didn't push it. Judges who have sat on the bench for 3 decades develop a highly specific, infallible instinct for which emotional doors are actually locked from the inside, and which ones just look that way. He seemed to decide correctly that mine was the first kind. There was one specific night, close to midnight, when the two of us were exhausted, finishing a complex bench memo on a corporate tax case that had absolutely nothing to do with either of us personally. He suddenly set his red pen down on the mahogany desk, looked at me over his glasses, and asked out of nowhere whether I had anyone waiting up for me at home. I came closer in that exact moment than I ever had before, or since, to completely breaking down and telling him the whole pathetic thing. The lie, the silence, the erased emails, the decade of being a ghost. I got as far as opening my mouth before deciding, once again, that the truth needed to belong only to me a little longer before I handed it to anyone else, even someone as safe and respected as Marcus Thorne. I just smiled tiredly and told him I was perfectly fine on my own. He looked at me a beat too long, the exact way perceptive people do when they absolutely know they're being given a heavily edited version of reality, and then he graciously let it go. I never told him a single detail about my family beyond that. I let him assume, the way everyone assumes about a driven young clerk with no visible family at graduation, that I simply didn't have much of one. And I let that easy assumption do the heavy lifting that the truth wasn't allowed to do anymore. I passed the bar exam with the highest score in my state cohort that year. I proudly framed the certificate in thick mahogany, hung it on my office wall, and mailed absolutely nobody a photo of it. I became an assistant prosecutor, grinding out grueling 60-hour weeks. Then I became a senior prosecutor. Then an appellate attorney, confidently arguing complex constitutional cases I used to only read about in heavy casebooks with cracked spines. For the first 3 years, I stubbornly sent birthday cards to my parents. It was a pathetic habit I kept even after the deafening silence made it feel a little insane. Just a standard card in the mail, with no return address they would have honored anyway. And then, quietly, I stopped. I stopped the year none of the previous 3 had ever been acknowledged in any way. I aggressively built a life that didn't ask their permission to be good. I told myself that the work, the respect of my peers, and the pursuit of justice was enough. Some weeks, it actually even was. A senior colleague at the prosecutor's office, a sharp, empathetic woman named Sarah, who had worked closely beside me for 4 years by then, asked me once over stale break room coffee whether I was close with my family. She asked it in the offhand, casual way people ask when they're really just making polite conversation between grueling hearings. I told her we didn't talk much, and I deliberately kept my eyes glued to the thick case file in my hands. She nodded slowly, read my body language, and let the subject drop the way most polite people did once they registered exactly how little room I left in the sentence. I got incredibly good over those long years at leaving exactly that much room and absolutely no more. Enough truth to end the probing question, but not nearly enough to invite a dangerous follow-up. 6 years into practicing law at the highest level, the governor's office called me about a sudden judicial vacancy on the county bench. The vetting process was brutal and took 4 agonizing months. There were deep financial disclosures, a rigorous bar standing review, and an intimidating in-person panel with 3 sitting judges. Then came the governor's Judicial Appointments Council, led by a meticulous, terrifying man named Thomas Vance, who read my massive file like he was actively hunting for the one tiny crack that would sink the whole nomination. He found one. It wasn't the truth. It was a rumor. A vague, second-hand whisper some thorough background investigator had picked up from an old law school acquaintance who had apparently heard, years back, that I had left the university under a dark cloud of academic dishonesty. Vance called me back into his office for a second sit-down over it, entirely alone this time. No panel, just a thick manila folder and 2 cups of terrible vending machine coffee that neither of us touched. He read the ugly allegation out loud, his voice flat and unembellished, the exact way I would later learn to read criminal charges into a public record myself. He looked me dead in the eye and asked me directly whether there was any truth to it at all. I didn't argue. I just calmly opened my briefcase and handed him the exact same sealed transcript, the exact same registrar's letter, and the exact same flawless paper trail that nobody in my own family had ever once asked to see. He put on his reading glasses and read it in absolute silence for a long, agonizing 2 minutes. Then, he took off his glasses, nodded once, and said, "That's the last we'll need to discuss this, Julian." He never brought it up again. It was the single most thorough, most respectful, and most fair hearing that specific lie had ever received, and it came from a total stranger who owed me absolutely nothing. I was officially sworn in at 35 years old, in a beautiful, wood-paneled courtroom with maybe 40 folding chairs set up for family and friends of the appointees. I remember standing there in my new black robe, counting without meaning to, exactly how many of those chairs were completely empty on the side where a loving family would have sat. Evelyn, my registrar from law school, actually came. Judge Thorne came, fully retired by then, walking slowly with a silver-tipped cane he stubbornly pretended he didn't need. He gave a short, incredibly dry toast about how the law rewards patience far more than it rewards raw talent. At the time, I took it as a massive compliment about my legal career, and only years later understood he might have meant it much more broadly than that. Nobody from my family came, because nobody from my family knew there was anything to come to. I shook 40 hands that afternoon, accepted the congratulations, and drove home to an impeccably clean, silent apartment with no one in it to tell. 10 years of total silence. I told myself sitting on the bench that I had finally made peace with it. It was the specific, highly structured peace of a man who has simply stopped checking a deep wound to see if it's healed, because the act of checking is its own specific kind of hurting. I didn't know, sitting in my chambers most mornings with my black coffee and my heavy docket, that absolutely all of it was about to land violently back in my courtroom, wearing a federal defendant's number. Update 1. The case file had come up through the normal, randomized computer rotation 2 weeks earlier. It was assigned by the clerk's office the exact way every single case was assigned. There was no red flag, no warning mark, absolutely nothing in our sophisticated conflict check system to catch it. Why? Because Maya had married 9 years ago and proudly taken her husband's last name. The judicial system checks names, not deeply buried family histories. I didn't even know that specific detail yet, that morning in chambers. I only knew a defendant named Maya Sterling was scheduled for a federal arraignment at 9:15 a.m., and that I had roughly 90 minutes to decide exactly what kind of man I was going to be about it. The nonprofit she defrauded was called the Oak Ridge Youth Alliance, a small, underfunded organization that ran vital after-school programs in 3 lower-income counties. Maya had worked there for 8 years as their financial director. She had been there long enough to become the one person everyone implicitly trusted to sign off on massive vendor invoices without a second set of eyes. Assistant U.S. Attorney Chloe Hastings, a brilliant woman with 11 years of experience prosecuting complex white-collar and public corruption cases, had meticulously built the case off an anonymous tip to the board about a vendor nobody could actually locate at its listed physical address. From there, the investigation was ruthlessly methodical. Bank records were aggressively subpoenaed under a grand jury order. A sophisticated shell company was traced to a remote P.O. box that Maya had opened under a slightly misspelled version of her own maiden name. The massive money transfers were broken down into smaller amounts, just under the $10,000 threshold that would have triggered an automatic banking compliance review. The government's lead forensic accountant, a man named Martin Hayes, who had spent 19 years auditing nonprofit and municipal fraud cases, had built the financial reconciliation the exact same patient, terrifying way any good forensic accountant does. He pulled 4 years of the organization's massive disbursement ledgers, meticulously matched each flagged invoice against a state vendor registry, and found, again and again, a fake business license number that traced back to absolutely nothing at all. His final report ran to 65 dense pages and established an unbreakable, clean chain of custody on every single forged document. It was the exact kind of flawless paper trail a defense attorney can desperately chip at, but never, ever really break. 9 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of embezzlement. The Oak Ridge board chair had reportedly wept openly while reading the financial summary aloud at an emergency meeting. That last detail was according to a specific line in the government's charging memo that had absolutely nothing to do with the rigid letter of the law, and everything to do with why any of this deeply mattered in the first place. I sat with the massive file open in front of me for far longer than I actually needed to, well past the point where reading it again was intellectually useful. I was doing it because some irrational, desperate part of my brain was still hoping the second reading would magically produce a different name. It didn't. At exactly 8:50 a.m., I picked up my phone and called Chief Judge David Carmichael. He was a man with 26 years on the state bench, and the one person any formal recusal in our courthouse absolutely had to go through. I told him, without much preamble or emotion, that the defendant scheduled for my 9:15 morning docket was my estranged sister, and that I fully intended to recuse myself on the permanent record the exact moment the case was called. Carmichael was completely quiet for a long second on the other end of the line. He wasn't disapproving, he was just doing the exact same rapid mental math I had already done. "Julian," he said slowly, "you could hand this file off right now. Quietly. Before anyone in the press pool sees your name attached to it at all. Nobody outside this specific office would ever need to know why you stepped away." I told him I had already thought about that, and I had. For about 4 agonizing seconds, standing by my chamber's large window with the heavy file in my hand, staring out at the city below, I had wanted badly, in some incredibly old, unrepaired, bleeding part of myself, to finally be the one person in the room who knew the whole absolute truth and got to say so out loud. It would have been so incredibly easy to just transfer it. Nobody would have ever caught it, and that was exactly why I couldn't do it. I told Carmichael that I wanted it on the official record. I wanted it in open court, where it would actually mean something profound, instead of just being another secret protecting me. He pulled up the judicial canon on his own computer screen while we talked. He read the relevant section back to me almost gently, as if he deeply suspected I already had it completely memorized and just desperately needed to hear it in someone else's voice to anchor myself. He said that my choice was the much harder road, but he deeply respected it. He also said he would have the courthouse media liaison ready on standby, just in case the aggressive press pool caught wind of the family name before I even got the chance to say it myself. I hadn't slept well the night before, completely unrelated to this. I had been up at 5:15 a.m., made a pot of coffee I didn't finish, and stood at my own kitchen counter, a much nicer marble one than the leaking studio setup from law school, but with the exact same nervous habit of drinking it lukewarm and highly distracted. I had driven to the courthouse taking the long way, purposely driving past the exact neon diner where I had eaten that first solitary Thanksgiving sandwich a decade ago. It was a route I usually avoided without quite admitting to myself why. I had sat in the dark parking garage for 4 full minutes with the engine completely off before I could force myself to walk into the building. At 9:10 a.m., my law clerk knocked softly on the door to say the courtroom was completely full. What was supposed to be a slow Tuesday docket had suddenly turned into a much busier one because a stringer from the local newspaper had been sitting in on an unrelated bail hearing earlier. According to the bailiff, the reporter had already started aggressively asking around about the Sterling case the exact moment the morning docket sheet was posted on the board. I had much less of a window than I had originally planned on. It was either going on the record in the next 5 minutes, or it was a massive headline breaking the story before I did, followed by a defense motion questioning whether I had maliciously tried to sit quietly on a case I should never have legally touched. I stood at the small, full-length mirror by my chamber's closet for exactly as long as it took to straighten my heavy black robe, and not a single second longer. Looking at myself in the mirror for any real length of time felt like an emotional indulgence I didn't have 90 seconds to spare on. My throat was incredibly tight walking down the back hallway to the bench. My pulse was doing something erratic that I could physically feel pounding in my ears. It was a fast, dull thud that had absolutely nothing to do with nerves about the law itself. I knew the law here completely cold. I knew exactly what the judicial canon rigidly required, and I knew exactly how to phrase it cleanly and professionally. It was the other part, the deeply personal part with no legal citation, that had my hands freezing cold despite the heavy wool of the robe. 2 full decades of not knowing how this confrontation would go, and I was about to find out in front of 40 strangers and a hungry reporter with a notepad. My hands, notably, were still not shaking. It was a strange, highly specific steadiness. I noticed it the exact way you notice a sudden change in the weather. It was a factual observation about the moment, rather than a feeling I actually had the emotional room to sit inside of. Update 2. When I walked out of the heavy oak doors and onto the elevated bench, the courtroom did its usual, chaotic shuffle. Attorneys immediately stood up, thick stacks of paper rustled loudly, and the bailiff forcefully called the large room to order. The wooden gallery was much fuller than a standard Tuesday morning docket usually drew. There was a wide scatter of anxious families waiting on other minor matters. A young man with a laminated press badge clipped to his corduroy jacket pocket was taking up a prime aisle seat, his notebook already flipped open on his knee, pen poised. Maya walked through the side doors beside her expensive lawyer. She was meticulously adjusting her tailored blazer, looking completely composed, almost bored. It was the exact same flawless performance she had probably given our gullible parents 100 times across 100 kitchen tables. Her chin was perfectly level, her shoulders pulled back. She was a woman who had clearly spent a lifetime rehearsing looking unbothered, and had gotten incredibly good enough at it to fool almost any room she walked into. Her defense attorney was a man named Liam Croft. He had 16 years in high-stakes white-collar defense, and it took me a full, agonizing second longer than it should have to place his face. Because the last time I had seen Liam Croft, we were both 24 years old. He had been the exact guy back in law school who had heard the vicious cheating rumor entirely secondhand, and had quietly, cowardly stopped inviting me to his prestigious study group instead of just being a man and asking me about it himself. Liam was casually flipping through his own thick file as he walked toward the defense table, not yet looking up at the bench. I sat perfectly still, and I watched the moment arrive almost in slow motion. His eyes finally lifted from the typed papers, automatically finding the judge's bench out of ingrained habit the way any seasoned attorney does, and then, his eyes just stayed there. A half second too long. I sat there, draped in black, and I watched a decade of quiet, comfortable, arrogant certainty completely rearrange itself behind his eyes in real time. It is a profound thing to witness the exact moment a man realizes he spent 10 years believing a devastating story he never once bothered to fact-check. Then, Maya finally looked up. I watched the color completely drain out of her face the exact way water violently drains from a pulled tub. It was fast at first, and then, at the very end, it happened all at once. Her pristine, practiced mask entirely shattered. Liam leaned over and desperately whispered something frantic into her ear. Maya didn't respond to him. She just shook her head slightly, her eyes wide with absolute terror, still staring up at me like she was desperately waiting for the physical room to magically correct itself. Like she was waiting for someone to step in and explain the horrific mistake. The court clerk stood up and read the case aloud. The People versus Maya Sterling. The Honorable Judge Julian Vance presiding. She actually mouthed my first name as it echoed in the large room, like she still couldn't comprehend the reality of it. Mrs. Sterling, I said, leaning toward the microphone, keeping my voice exactly as flat, bored, and procedural as I would for any other random defendant on a Tuesday. Please rise for your arraignment. Her hands were violently shaking when she finally managed to stand up. Mine weren't. I read the severe charges into the permanent record. 9 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of embezzlement. I read the federal government's strong request that a high bail be set given her specific flight risk profile. I recited every single word in the exact same even, monotonous cadence I used for every single arraignment. I did it because the alternative was letting my voice do something emotional that I could never take back once the court reporter had it permanently typed into the public transcript. I have read terrible charges into the record hundreds of times in my career. I have never before had to consciously, painfully decide, sentence by agonizing sentence, not to let a single ounce of emotion show. Then, before Liam Croft could even take a step toward the wooden podium to enter a plea, I looked directly at the court reporter and stated firmly for the record, I am recusing myself from this case, effective immediately, due to a direct family relationship with the defendant. I said it the exact way you would read any other mundane line off a printed docket sheet. There was absolutely no inflection, no dramatic eye contact with Maya. I held the silence in the room a beat longer than necessary. Saying those exact words meant admitting an open, public court, in the exact same county where my parents still lived, that Maya Sterling, the accused fraudster, was my sister. And that I, the presiding federal judge, was the exact same brother she had proudly told everyone was a disgraced, pathetic dropout a decade ago. Chief Judge Carmichael had a replacement judge physically in the building inside of 20 minutes. Maya was released later that exact same afternoon on a $50,000 bond, with a strict travel restriction and a surrendered passport, which was completely standard for the severity of the charges. None of that happened in front of me. I had already signed the official recusal order and walked calmly back to my chambers by the time any of it occurred. I passed AUSA Chloe Hastings in the busy hallway on my way back. She was quickly gathering her own thick files for the reassigned hearing. She stopped just long enough to look me in the eye and say that she thought I had handled it the exact right way. She said it was clean, perfectly on the record, with absolutely no unnecessary theater about it. She casually mentioned that she had seen older judges in much smaller conflicts than this one try to slide a case sideways without ever having the guts to say why. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was the specific, rare respect one hardened professional gives another for doing the much harder, completely transparent thing when the cowardly, easier one was sitting right there for the taking. The story ran in the local newspaper 2 days later. It was 3 concise paragraphs in the county section, mostly detailing the mechanics of the nonprofit fraud itself. There was exactly one sentence at the very end noting that the judge originally assigned to the high-profile case had immediately recused himself, citing a direct family relationship with the defendant. There was no further sensational detail, because I had strictly asked the clerk's office to give the hungry reporter absolutely nothing further, and Carmichael had forcefully backed that up without being asked twice. Carmichael also confirmed on the record, when that same reporter called his office directly fishing for drama, that the recusal had been handled perfectly by the book and the case reassigned the exact same morning. It was a fact Chloe Hastings' own office repeated almost verbatim when aggressively asked whether the prosecution's timeline had been affected in any way. It hadn't. The massive weight of the federal case moved forward exactly as it would have with any other defendant. Which was, in the absolute end, the entire point of standing up in open court and saying the words out loud instead of finding a quieter way around them. It was enough. 3 short paragraphs in a local paper was enough for my mother to finally find it, or for some gossiping neighbor to send it to her. Because she called my cell phone for the first time in 10 years. The following evening. It was a phone number I still had saved, completely unchanged, for the entire decade. I answered it on the 3rd ring. She didn't apologize, she didn't say hello. She just asked quietly, her voice much smaller and frailer than I remembered it. Older, too, in the specific, heartbreaking way 10 hard years does to a voice you haven't heard in that long. Is it true, Julian? She asked, her breath catching. All of it? I stood by my kitchen window, looking out at the city lights. Which part? I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. The part where I was never actually expelled from law school and became a judge? Or the part where your golden daughter stole $450,000 from a children's charity? She didn't have an answer for either. She just cried softly into the receiver, the same soft, tragic crying Maya used to do. But this time, it didn't make me want to protect her. I hung up the phone. Liam Croft called my direct chambers line himself a week later. He called on a minor matter that had absolutely nothing to do with Maya's case. It was a standard scheduling question on an unrelated corporate file, something about a discovery deadline neither of us particularly cared about. And at the very end of the call, almost as a heavy afterthought, his voice completely dropping out of its usual, confident courtroom register, he said he was deeply sorry, for whatever it was worth. He admitted that he had never once picked up the phone and asked me directly, instead of just letting the ugly story make sense of itself in his head. He said he had thought about it a lot since the arraignment. He had turned it over in his mind the exact way you turn over any massive assumption you're deeply embarrassed to find out was never actually checked. The exact same way I imagine he once turned over a study group invitation email he cowardly decided never to send. I told him it was a long time ago. I kept it professional. I didn't tell him that it had taken 10 full years and a massive federal wire fraud indictment for anyone in my life to finally do that basic math out loud. Maya eventually took a plea deal. 18 months in federal prison, full financial restitution to the Oak Ridge Youth Alliance, the standard, heavy conditions. I wasn't in the courtroom for her sentencing, and I absolutely didn't need to be. I had already gotten out of one 90-second arraignment hearing what 10 agonizing years of silence had never once managed to give me. The truth was finally sitting somewhere everyone in the room could clearly see it.